She came down from the mountain at the end of March, and the people of Blackwood Ridge went quiet when they saw her. Not the quiet of surprise, the quiet of reckoning. She walked on snowshoes she had made herself from pine branches and rawhide strips she had cut from a hide she cured in the back of a limestone cave, 4,000 feet above the valley floor. Her coat was elk skin and wool, and the remnants of 2 blankets stitched together with sinew. Her face was the color of bark. Her hands were the color of stone. Her eyes had the quality of something that had looked at the worst the mountain could offer, and had not looked away. She was 63 years old. She had spent 5 months inside the bones of Blackwood Ridge, while winter tried every key it had. None of them fit. But to understand what she had become by the time she walked back into that town, you have to understand what she had been 4 days after her husband's funeral, standing on the porch of the cabin they had built with their own hands, watching a truck climb the frozen road toward her home, while the soil on Earl's grave was still dark and loose. Earl Calloway had died on a Tuesday morning in November of 1882. He had been cutting timber on the upper slope, which was work he had done 1,000 times before, work that had shaped his shoulders and his hands, and the specific, unhurried efficiency of every movement he made outdoors. He had been there. And then a branch came down. Not from the tree he was working, from a dead pine 40 yards upslope that the morning wind chose at precisely the wrong moment. And that was the end of everything that had been ordinary. Wren found him 2 hours later. She was 63 years old, and she had been married to Earl Calloway for 35 years. And she had walked this mountain with him through every season it possessed. And she had learned from him and alongside him, and occasionally ahead of him. And she had built the better part of their life here, with her own hands as much as his. She was not a woman who expected the world to be gentle. She had not expected it to be this particular kind of cruel. She covered him with her coat. She sat with him until the light changed. Then she went down to the settlement and found 2 men to help her carry him home. She buried him herself. The grave was behind the cabin beneath the pine that had been his landmark tree, the one he had used to orient himself every morning when he stepped outside to read the weather. She dug until her shoulders stopped hurting because the pain went past feeling. And then she dug some more. And then she lowered him in and she covered him, and she set a stone from the creek at the head of the grave because he would have wanted stone rather than wood. She did not sleep for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, she was standing at the kitchen stove when she heard the sound of a truck on the road below. She knew before she reached the porch. There were things about Denton Calloway that Wren had understood since the first year of her marriage. Things she had filed away in the part of her mind where she kept information that was important but did not yet require action. He was Earl's younger brother by 9 years. He had come to Colorado from Ohio the same year they had. But where Earl had put his energy into the land, Denton had put his into watching other people's land and calculating its value. He had never been cruel in any open way. He had simply been patient in a manner that had always suggested he was waiting for something. He stepped out of the truck and his boots hit the frozen ground with the sound of a man who believed he was walking on something that already belonged to him. Behind him came Vera, his wife, her face as sharp and arranged as cut stone, her eyes moving across the cabin and the outbuildings and the timber on the upper slope, with an efficiency that was not curiosity but assessment. They did not bring food. They did not bring condolences that amounted to anything. They brought a leather folio. Denton opened it on the porch railing without being invited to do so. He told her about the debt. He told her about the note Earl had signed 5 years ago, a loan taken against the cabin, and the claim when a late spring had destroyed the first planting, and they had needed seed money for a second attempt. He told her about the interest that had accumulated. He told her about the signature of Sheriff Lucius Crane, who had reviewed the transfer and approved it. Wren stood on the porch and listened to every word. She listened with the specific attention of a woman who has spent 6 decades learning to hear, not just what people said, but what they were trying to accomplish by saying it. She listened and she understood that this had been planned. Not since yesterday. Not since Earl died. The machinery of it was too smooth for recent construction. This had been built over time the way certain kinds of betrayal were built piece by piece in the dark, where no one was looking. She said, "This is my home." Denton held up the deed. He spoke about the law. He spoke about the sheriff's approval. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who has made sure that every relevant door is locked before he begins the conversation. Vera said you have 1 hour. 1 hour. Wren looked at Vera's face and found nothing there that resembled regret or apology or even the social performance of those things. She found a woman doing arithmetic. She looked at the porch boards that Earl had replaced the summer before his death. The boards that still held the shape of his work. Clean joints and level surface, the signature of a careful man. She looked at the mountains above the ridge. Then she went inside. She did not think about what she felt. There was no time for what she felt. What she felt was a door that she would open later when she could afford to stand still. And right now, she could not afford to stand still. She went through the cabin the way her mind had organized it, not by sentiment, but by utility. Earl's rifle, which she knew as well as she knew her own hands, having cleaned and loaded it every autumn for 30 years. Ammunition, enough of it. The heavy axe he kept sharp because a dull axe was dangerous, and Earl had not been a man who accepted unnecessary danger. The cast iron pot that had been her mother's, and before that her grandmother's, a piece of cookware that had survived 4 decades of hard use because it was made to survive hard use. His hunting knife. 2 wool blankets, the heaviest ones. Beans, flour, salt, matches. She did not take the wedding photograph from the mantelpiece. She did not take the china her mother had sent west with her as a wedding gift. She did not take the letters she had kept in the tin box under the bed, letters from Earl, written during the one winter they had spent apart in the early years of the marriage. Not because these things did not matter, because they would not help her live, and living was the only thing that was going to allow her to matter back. She came out of the cabin with the canvas pack on her back and the rifle in her hand, and she walked past Denton Calloway on his own porch, and she did not speak. He called after her. He said, "Wolves are hungry this year, Wren." She did not turn around. There were people in their yards as she walked down the settlement road. She registered them without looking directly at them, the way you registered the features of terrain you were moving through, noting what was there without allowing it to slow you. A neighbor at his fence line. 2 women outside the general store. The smith at his open door. All of them watching. None of them moving toward her. She understood that as well. A community was not always what it appeared to be when everything was ordinary. The true shape of a community showed itself in the moments when it was easy to stay inside and watch through a window. Most of these people were not bad people. They were cautious people. They were people with their own families and their own debts and their own arrangements with Sheriff Crane, and a 63-year-old widow being put off her land was not a thing that called for intervention when the paperwork was in order, and the sheriff had signed it. She did not blame them. She also did not forgive them. Not yet. She walked until the settlement was behind her, and the road turned to trail, and the trail turned to the elk path that ran north along the creek, before cutting up the eastern face of the ridge. The pack weighed what it weighed, and her shoulders knew it. and she set her feet with the deliberate care of someone who understood that a turned ankle on this ground, this late in the day, would be the end of things. The afternoon light was failing fast. November afternoons in the Colorado mountains did not negotiate. She was climbing towards something Earl had shown her 10 years earlier. Something he had taken her to on a warm September Sunday, when the aspens were turning, and he had said, standing at the entrance, that a person could live in a place like this if they needed to. She had asked him why a person would need to. He had not answered directly. He had only looked at her with the expression he used when he wanted her to file something away, rather than examine it immediately. She had filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that were important before they became necessary. Now they were necessary. Devil's Throat was what the miners had called it years ago, before the silver played out and the camps emptied. She did not know who had given it the name, and she did not like the name particularly. But the name was not what mattered. What mattered was the limestone formation above the eastern ridge, the cave that opened narrow at the entrance and widened inside into a chamber, large enough to work in, with a ceiling that arched 30 feet overhead, and a crack at its highest point that ran all the way to the surface like a chimney, that the mountain had built for itself over the long, slow work of geological ages. If she could reach it before dark, she could light a fire. If she could light a fire, she could survive the night. If she could survive the night, she could begin. The light was nearly gone when she dragged the cart over the rocky outcrop below the cave entrance. Her shoulders were burning. Her hands had blistered on the cart handles, and the blisters had torn, and the raw flesh beneath was sticking to the wood in the way that raw flesh stuck to things when it had been worked too long. She wrapped strips of cloth from her coat lining around her palms and continued. The entrance was a vertical crack in the cliff face, barely wide enough to turn sideways and push through. She had forgotten how narrow it was. She went through it anyway. Inside, the silence was immediate and absolute, a different kind of silence than the outside silence which had wind and the small sounds of a mountain at the edge of winter. This was the silence of enclosed stone, the silence of a space that had been sealed from the weather for 10,000 years. She struck a match. The flame caught the darkness with the tentative courage of a small thing deciding to persist, and in its light the walls of the cave appeared around her pale limestone, catching the glow and holding it for a moment, before the shadows claimed the middle and upper distances. Cold. Not the cutting wind cold of outside, the still cold of enclosed stone that had held the same temperature through every season, because it was insulated from them. All the cold of the earth's interior, carried upward through the rock to this quiet chamber. She could work with still cold. She could not work with wind. She set her pack down. She found the firewood she had left here 6 months ago on her last visit. A small stack of dry deadfall she had cached after Earl showed her the place, an instinct she could not have explained at the time, but that she had followed because he had shown her to follow instincts when it came to this mountain. The fire she built was small. It had to be small because the crack above was the chimney, and the crack above was also the cave's only real vulnerability. The place where if she built too large a fire, the smoke would bank rather than rise, and the chamber would fill with the invisible killer. Before she understood what was happening, she had learned this from Earl. She was going to survive on what Earl had taught her, and what she had taught herself, and the specific, fierce refusal of a woman who had not come this far to lie down in a cave and give Denton Calloway the satisfaction of never being wrong. She ate beans she cooked over the small fire. She wrapped herself in both blankets. She sat with her back against the limestone wall and looked at the fire and let herself feel for the first time since Tuesday morning the full weight of what had happened. Earl was gone. He had been gone for 4 days. And she had been so occupied with the practical requirements of those 4 days, the burial and the shock, and then the sudden requirement for action that Denton had provided, that she had not yet sat still with the fact of it. She sat still with it now. 35 years was not a small thing to lose. It was the architecture of an entire life, the structure that everything else was built around. And when that structure was gone, you did not simply continue as the same person in a different arrangement. You became someone who had to rebuild from whatever remained standing. What remained standing was her, 63 years old in a cave on the side of a mountain in November with a rifle and an axe, and enough food to last a month, if she was careful, which she intended to be. She thought about what Earl had said, standing at this cave entrance on a September Sunday 10 years ago, that a person could live in a place like this. He had not said survive. He had said live. She intended to hold him to that distinction. In the morning, she assessed what she had and what she needed, which was the only productive question available to her, and which she approached with the systematic attention of someone who had been managing the logistics of a mountain homestead for 35 years, and had learned to separate what was urgent from what was merely uncomfortable. The cave was large enough. The chimney crack was functional. The stone floor was workable. The entrance was small enough to defend from weather and from anyone who did not know it was there. What she needed was wood. Quantities of wood that would not be fully available from the small cache she had left. Quantities sufficient to fuel the fire through 4 months of serious mountain winter. She needed food beyond the beans and flour she had carried up, protein and variety that could sustain a working body through sustained cold and sustained physical labor. She needed to secure the entrance in a way that reduced the cave's heat loss without eliminating the ventilation that the chimney crack provided. She picked up the axe. She went to work. For 3 weeks, she worked 14 hours each day, stopping only when the light made it dangerous to continue, and resuming when the light returned. She felled dead timber on the lower slope, the standing deadfall that had been dry in the tree for a season or more, and would burn clean without the excessive smoke that green wood produced. She limbed the logs and cut them to length and dragged them up the slope to the cave entrance, a process that took 4 trips for what a strong man in good condition could have carried in 2. And she made those 4 trips without complaint, because complaint would not make her stronger, and the work would. 6 feet high and 10 feet deep. The wood wall grew beside the cave entrance, stacked with the tight precision that Earl had always insisted upon, because poorly stacked wood shifted, and poorly stacked wood invited moisture, and moisture was the enemy of everything you were trying to preserve. Her hands blistered again. She rewrapped them. She continued. She set 20 deadfall traps along the game trails that crossed the upper slope. The trails that Thomas had shown her, the places where snowshoe hares and marmots and squirrels moved through the timber on their regular routes. She set the traps with the specific patience of a woman who had done this before, and who understood that patience was not passive, but active, the deliberate discipline of someone who knew that the outcome was worth the investment of time. The traps produced. Every dawn she checked them with fingers stiff from the cold, and every few days something was there, and she skinned it and jointed it and hung the meat on the smoking rack she had built beneath the chimney crack, where the smoke from her evening fire could cure the flesh, slowly infusing it with the preserving compounds of hickory smoke before the deepening cold could complete the work of preservation through freezing alone. The cave began to smell like something that was going to get through winter. She gathered pine nuts from the caches that squirrels had made and abandoned or partially abandoned digging through the early snow to find them. She dug cattail roots from the frozen margins of the creek 200 feet below the cave, a cold and muddy process that was worth the effort because the cattail root had caloric value and could be pounded into something like flour when dried. She collected rose hips from the thorn bushes along the cliff face, the red berries that held vitamin against scurvy and that could be boiled into a medicinal tea that Earl had taught her, was the thing that kept mountain men functional through long winters without fresh produce. She was 63 years old, and she was doing this alone. And she was doing it without complaint or self-congratulation, because neither served any purpose, and she had too much work to accommodate useless things. It was in the 4th week when the routine had settled into the particular rhythm of sustained survival work, when her body had adjusted to the altitude and the labor and the cold, and she had begun to feel something that she recognized as the possibility of adequacy, that she came back from the lower ridge with a basket of roots and found the entrance exposed. The boughs she had laid across the gap as concealment had been pulled away, not by wind, by hands. The boot prints in the frost beside the entrance were large and heavy, the prints of a man who walked with the confidence of someone who did not expect to be questioned. She picked up the rifle. She went inside. What she found made the breath leave her body in a single controlled exhalation. The smoking rack had been kicked over. The dried meat that had taken 3 weeks to produce lay crushed into the dirt of the cave floor, ground under boot heels, with a thoroughness that spoke of deliberate destruction rather than casual damage. The flour sack had been slashed open, its contents broadcast across stone where no human hands could recover it. A third of the wood stack was gone. Her knife was embedded in a log pinning a piece of paper. She recognized the handwriting before she had fully read the words. He had found her. He had come up here in the time she had been away into a cave that was not on any map, and he had done this, and then he had walked back down the mountain. He did not need to explain himself further. He had said what he came to say. The cave was his. The mountain was his. Let Winter finish what he had started. She knelt on the floor of the cave that she had spent 3 weeks making survivable, among the ruins of the work she had done. And she screamed. The sound she made was not dignified. It was not the controlled grief of a woman who had decided she was too old for outward emotion. It was the raw sound of a human animal who has been pushed past the edge of what composure can manage, and it came up from somewhere below her ribs and left through her mouth and hit the limestone walls and came back to her altered, larger, more animal than when it had left. She let it come. She gave it exactly the time it needed, and no more. Then she stood up. She was 63 years old, and she was in a cave above the timberline in November with a third less wood and no flour, and enough dried meat to last perhaps 2 weeks, if she was careful. Denton Calloway knew where she was. He would come again. Whatever she had built here was no longer safe, but he did not know about the back chamber. The tunnel narrowed past the main chamber, narrowed to a place where a person had to turn sideways and press through and beyond. That narrowing, it opened again into a second room, smaller, darker, accessible only to someone who already knew it was there and was willing to commit to the passage through the dark. Earl had shown her. She had remembered. He had always shown her the back exits. She had 2 days of work ahead of her. She began immediately. Moving everything took 2 days and parts of 2 nights. Every log, every piece of meat that could be salvaged from the floor, and there was less of it than she had hoped, because Denton's boots had been thorough, pressing the dried flesh into the grit and moisture of the cave floor until it was contaminated beyond recovery. Every tool, every blanket, the cast iron pot, the rifle and the ammunition, the remaining beans, the matches wrapped in the oilcloth she had used to protect them from humidity, everything that could be carried through a passage that was 4 feet high, at its narrowest point, a tunnel that required her to turn sideways with the load pressed against her chest, and her back scraping stones simultaneously, a passage that a larger person could not have navigated at all. She was grateful for the first time to be small. She made the carry over and over and over, back and forward, through the connecting passage, her shoulders complaining and then going past complaint into the territory of useful numbness that hard, repetitive work eventually produced. She did not count the trips. Counting would have made the number real in a way that was not helpful. When everything was through, she addressed the entrance. The work of concealment was the most precise work she had done since arriving on this mountain, more precise than the trap setting and more deliberate than the wood stacking, because it was work that had to be convincing to someone who was looking for her specifically. Denton would come back. She did not know when, but she knew he would come, because he was a man who did not leave unfinished things if finishing them was within his reach. She positioned 3 large stones across the narrowing of the passage stones that she had to move in stages because their weight exceeded what her arms could lift without her legs underneath them. She packed dead thorn brush between and around the stones, the kind of dense, dry thorn thicket that grew along the cliff base below the cave material she had gathered in 2 armloads before sealing the back chamber entirely. She arranged it with the specific eye of someone who had spent 35 years observing how rock falls looked on a mountainside, how the natural collapse of limestone settled, how the character of an abandoned place accumulated. From the front chamber, looking back, it appeared that the passage had fallen in on itself at some point in the geological past. The stones sat the way stones sat when gravity had placed them. The thorn brush caught in the gaps, the way thorn brush caught when it had been growing in them for decades. She went through the back. She made the final piece of seal from inside, pulling a flat stone across the narrowest point of the passage, a stone she had positioned for exactly this purpose, wedging it into a crack in the floor so that it could be moved from inside by someone who knew which direction to push, but would resist any attempt from the outside to determine that it was movable. Then she was in the back chamber, and the back chamber was sealed and she was invisible. The back chamber was smaller than the front, perhaps 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with a ceiling that arched 8 feet overhead at the highest point and descended to the height of her raised hand at the rear. The same limestone formation, the same damp mineral smell. The crack in the ceiling above the midpoint of the chamber was smaller than the one in the front room, but it was there running all the way to the surface, and she confirmed its function with a match held beneath it, watching the flame lean and tilt with the slight draw of air that told her the crack was open. She could build fire. She was alive in the mountain. The first night in the back chamber was different from the first nights in the front. The front chamber had been an emergency refuge when she arrived. The back chamber was something more deliberate, something she had chosen and prepared, and sealed herself into with the specific intention of surviving inside it for as long as the mountain required. She built a small fire and sat beside it and conducted a careful inventory of what she had. Wood for approximately 6 weeks of small fires. Dried meat for perhaps 2 weeks. Beans for 3 weeks if she was careful. A handful of pine nuts. A collection of dried roots. Salt. Matches a quantity that required conservation. Not enough. Not nearly enough for what was still to come, but enough to begin from. Enough to work forward from. And she was still mobile, still capable of going out at night to set and check traps and cut wood from the timber below, just from different locations. Now from the places Denton would not think to look, because they required climbing past safe terrain and into the exposed cliff sections above the timberline, where a man of his build and his habits would not go. She adjusted her routes. She moved only at night after the cave was sealed. slipping out through the small secondary opening at the back of the chamber, the crack that opened barely wide enough for a person with her frame to work through. Horizontally pressing forward with her elbows, while her feet found purchase on the stone below. This exit emerged on the cliff face 30 feet above and 50 feet north of the main entrance, invisible from the ground below, accessible only to someone who knew it was there, and had the specific kind of willingness that came from having no other option. At night, the mountain had a different character than it had during the day. She had known this intellectually for her whole life on the mountain. Night was when the predators moved, when the temperature dropped fastest, when the features that were navigable by day became treacherous by the changed quality of light. She learned it in her body now through weeks of moving across ground that her feet had to read because her eyes could not do the full work in moonlight and starlight and the occasional cloud-obscured dark of a November mountain night. She fell twice in the first week. Both times she caught herself without serious injury. The instinct of a person who had spent a lifetime on rough ground and had trained into her nervous system. The compensating reflex that turned a fall into a roll that converted downward momentum into something that dissipated across surface area, rather than concentrating in a joint or a bone. She got up both times. She continued. The traps in the new locations produced more slowly than the lower ones had. The cliff sections were less traveled by the small game she was hunting, but they were not untraveled because nothing in a working mountain ecosystem was unused, and she had enough patience and enough observation to find the paths and place the traps where the paths crossed. She brought the wood from a stand of dead timber she found on the north-facing slope above the secondary exit timber that required her to cut each piece short enough to pass through the crack and then restack inside before moving on to the next. It was inefficient labor, but it was labor that did not leave obvious traces. And efficiency was not her primary requirement. Invisibility was. And then the sky changed. It was the 28th of November. She had been watching the mountain long enough to read the signs not from a single indicator, but from the accumulation of them, the way the reading of weather on a mountain was never one thing but always a pattern, a convergence of evidence that a person who had been paying attention recognized the same way they recognized a familiar face. The pressure had been dropping for 2 days, but slowly the way serious weather built, rather than the way squall lines arrived. The birds had been moving south and down since the previous morning, not in the casual drifting patterns of ordinary daily movement, but with the directed purposefulness of creatures receiving a signal that did not require interpretation. The sky in the northwest had a color that was not quite right, a bruised purple at the horizon that was deeper and more still than the ordinary pre-storm colors she had seen on this mountain through 35 winters. The wind died. That was the final confirmation. When the mountain wind died in late November on a falling barometer, you had perhaps 2 hours. She used them. She went out through the crack at the back of the cliff and covered the lower timber stand in 40 minutes, cutting and hauling with the urgent efficiency of someone who understood that what she brought back in the next hour was the margin between adequate and desperate. She made 3 trips. Her arms were shaking on the 3rd trip. She made the 3rd trip anyway. She pulled the last log through the back crack and wedged it into place and sealed the opening and fed the fire and lay down in her blankets and listened. The silence that came before the storm on that particular evening was absolute in a way that the ordinary silences of the mountain were not. It was the absence of the small sounds, the creak of trees, and the scratch of small animals, and the distant concussion of a falling limb somewhere in the timber sounds that were so constant in normal mountain evenings that they formed a kind of texture to the air that a person only noticed when it was gone. And then the storm arrived and the silence ended, and what replaced it was something that did not have a proportionate name. It was not wind as she had understood wind before. Wind as she had known it for 63 years was a directional thing, a force that came from somewhere and went somewhere and had a character that changed as it moved. What came against Blackwood Ridge on the evening of November 28th was not directional in that sense. It was omnidirectional. It was the mountain being attacked from above and the mountain resisting. And the sound of that contest was something that occupied the full spectrum of audible frequency. And some frequencies she felt, rather than heard a pressure against the eardrum that communicated force beyond the capacity of hearing to fully process. The stones above her vibrated. She felt it through the rock she lay against the transmission of massive force through solid material. The mountain itself conducting information about what was happening on its surface into the chamber where she lay. For 5 days it did not stop. The routine of those 5 days was the most compressed and most monotonous existence she had known. A reduction of life to its absolute minimum transactions. She woke and she fed the fire, and she melted snow that blew in through the chimney crack in sufficient quantities to maintain hydration. And she cooked what she had and she slept. And she woke and she repeated each step with the precision of someone who understood that any deviation from the sequence was a deviation she could not afford. The fire required management. The chimney crack above was her lifeline in 2 senses. The exit route for smoke and the entry route for fresh air. And these 2 requirements had to be in balance, or the balance tipped into catastrophe. Too large a fire, and the draw was insufficient for the smoke volume, and the chamber began to fill. Too small a fire, and the temperature dropped past the point where function was possible. She had found the correct size through trial in the weeks before the storm. The specific quantity of fuel that produced the heat she needed without producing more smoke than the crack could carry away. And she fed the fire to that specific size with the attention of someone performing a calculation that had to be correct every time. She talked to Earl, not because she believed he could hear her, not because she had lost the grip on what was real and what was not, but because the human mind, when deprived of other voices, has a requirement for language that does not go away simply because there is no one else to receive it. And she had decided early in the 5 days that talking to Earl was better for her than the alternative, which was silence that grew and grew until it became indistinguishable from the interior of a mind that had given up. She told him about the traps. She told him about the wood she had found on the north slope. She told him about the way the limestone in the back chamber had a different mineral composition than the front, more quartz in it, and how she could see the quartz flecks catch the firelight when the flame angled correctly, and how she thought about him every time she saw them, because he would have known exactly what kind of geological process put quartz veins through limestone at this particular elevation. And he would have explained it to her with the particular enthusiasm he brought, to explaining things he had taught himself from books he had carried up a mountain on his back. She told him she was angry at him. She told him about the debt. She told him she understood why he had not told her, because she had known Earl Calloway for 35 years, and she understood the specific architecture of his shame, the way the part of him that was most confident about his ability to provide was also the part most silenced by any evidence that his providing had fallen short. She understood it, and she was furious about it, and she said so in the specific terms that she had been unable to use while the requirement for action had occupied all available space. She said she forgave him, not because she was finished being angry, but because the anger was beside the point now. He was gone and she was here, and being angry at the dead did not change either of those facts. What it changed was her in ways she could not afford. So she forgave him in the darkness and the firelight of her stone room while the mountain shook outside, and she let the anger go the way she had let the scream go 2 weeks earlier, completely and without reservation, and only as long as it needed to last. The 5th day, the storm began to slow. She knew it before she had any external evidence because she felt the change in the stone beneath her, the subsiding of vibration, the mountain's shoulders dropping from the sustained tension of the contest. An hour later, the sound outside had lost its omnidirectional quality and had become directional again. Wind from the northwest at a speed that was serious but not unprecedented. The ordinary serious wind of a mountain winter rather than the extraordinary thing that had been running for 5 days. She built the fire to its working size. She cooked the last of the beans. She made a mental inventory of what remained. She slept. She slept more deeply and more completely than she had slept since before Earl died, the deep, whole-body sleep of someone whose nervous system had been maintaining alert for 5 days and had finally received permission to release. And she did not dream, or if she dreamed, she did not remember it. And when she woke, the fire had burned down to coals, and the chamber was cooler than it should have been, and the quality of the light coming through the chimney crack above was the pale white of a winter morning after heavy snowfall. She lay in the blankets for a moment, assessing how she felt, which was the first thing she did every morning now, the systematic check-in with her own body that survival required, because her body was the only tool she had that could not be replaced. She was tired. She was thin. She was cold in the places that the blankets did not fully reach. But her mind was clear, and her limbs were functional, and the inventory of her condition was on balance acceptable. She pushed herself upright and reached for a piece of wood. She noticed the fire before she had processed why the fire was wrong. The flame was blue at the base, not the warm yellow-orange of a wood fire burning well, not even the lower red of a fire burning too slow. Blue, the specific cold color that a flame turned when the oxygen content of the air feeding it had been compromised. She tried to stand. Her legs did not fully respond. They moved, but not with the automatic obedience she was accustomed to. She made the distance to the edge of her sleeping position and felt the floor come up toward her in a way the floor was not supposed to come up. The throbbing behind her eyes was not the headache she woke with sometimes when the temperature had dropped in the night. It was different in quality and location. A pressure that was behind and above both eyes. Simultaneously, a pressure that was moving and building. She lay on the floor. She looked at the ceiling of the back chamber and the crack in it that was her chimney, and she understood. The storm had packed snow into the crack. 5 days of driven snow, finding every exterior opening and filling it, had sealed the chimney above the point where the draw was sufficient to carry the smoke away. The smoke from her fire had been accumulating in the back chamber, slowly below perceptible threshold, while she slept, while the storm ran itself out, while her body rested so completely that the warning signs had not been enough to penetrate the depth of the sleep. Carbon monoxide had no smell. It had no visible presence. It gave you a headache and made your limbs heavy. And then it gave you comfort, and the comfort was the trap. She looked across the chamber. Earl was sitting on the woodpile. He was wearing the red flannel shirt he had worn every autumn for the last decade of his life. The shirt she had mended at the elbow twice, and that he had refused to give up because it had become the correct weight and softness through years of washing and wearing, and was therefore irreplaceable. His face was the face she knew better than any other face in the world, relaxed and soft and present in the way it was present when he was at rest, when the day's work was done and he was simply being without requiring anything of himself. He looked at her with the expression he used when he wanted her to stop worrying. "Rest," he seemed to say. "It is warm now. It is safe. We are all right." She felt the warmth. It was not the warmth of the fire which had gone blue and low. It was a warmth that came from inside, from the center of the body. Outward, the specific warmth that was the body beginning to shut down unnecessary processes and conserve for the core. It was comfortable in the way that hypothermia was described as comfortable in the last stages, in the way that suffocation by carbon monoxide was described as comfortable at the end. She lay on the floor of the cave and looked at the man she had loved for 35 years and understood that she was dying, and that dying was being made to feel acceptable. And the part of her that was already compromised by the gas in the air said that acceptable was enough, that rest was what was needed, that Earl was here. The part of her that had moved 1,500 pounds of wood through a narrow tunnel and set traps in the dark and sealed herself into a mountain and screamed at limestone walls and forgiven a dead man for a debt she did not know existed, said something different. It said, "Find the axe." Her arms would not lift her. She rolled. She rolled from the sleeping position onto the floor, and the cold of the stone floor was the first useful thing, a shock to the surface of the body that was still capable of sensation. And she lay with her cheek against the stone and let the cold speak to her. She could not stand. She understood this clearly. Standing was not available. She began to crawl. Each movement of her arms required deliberate instruction from a mind that was operating with the specific clarity of someone working through deep water. Everything requiring more effort than it should. The signals traveling slowly from intention to action. She moved her right arm forward. She moved her left. She pressed her knees against the stone and dragged herself forward an inch and then another. The axe was against the wall at the back of the chamber on the right side, in the location where she placed it every evening before sleeping, because she had decided when she first came into this chamber that she would always know where every tool was in the dark. She found the handle with her right hand. She could not stand, but she could push herself up onto her knees, and from her knees she could reach the ceiling at the base of the chimney crack, which was the lowest point of the crack, the place where the stone was thinnest between the chamber air and the open air above. She pushed herself up onto her knees. The chamber tilted. Earl was still on the woodpile. His expression had not changed. He was not alarmed. He was waiting. She raised the axe. The first blow was wrong because her arms were wrong. The coordination between intention and motion degraded by the gas in her blood, and the blade hit the stone wall instead of the ceiling, and the impact traveled back into her wrists, and she nearly dropped the handle. She adjusted. She raised the axe again. She aimed at the ceiling. The second blow hit the crack. The stone did not give. Limestone was not wood, and it did not give the way wood gave, and she had known this before she started, and she swung again anyway because there was no other option, and options that did not exist did not count. Her vision was contracting. The third blow, the crack opened, not dramatically, not with the release of a block pipe running clear. A small cascade of packed snow fell into the chamber and landed on her hands and arms, and the fire died instantly in the rush of cold air that followed the snow through the expanded crack, and the chamber went completely dark. In the darkness, the cold hit her. It was the specific cold of mountain air rushing into an enclosed space that had been holding warmth, and it was violent in its immediacy. the temperature dropping in seconds from the compromised warmth of the gas-filled chamber to something closer to the true temperature of a November night on the eastern face of Blackwood Ridge. She collapsed. She lay on the stone floor in the complete dark, with cold air pouring over her from above, and she breathed. Each breath was sharp. Each breath was painful, in the way that sharp cold air was painful in compromised lungs. A burning that was productive. That was the lungs doing what they were designed to do when given the material they needed to do it. The pressure behind her eyes began to loosen. Earl was not on the woodpile. There was no woodpile visible because the chamber was dark and the fire was out. There was only cold stone and cold air, and her own hands in front of her face, and the sound of her breathing becoming more regular, more controlled, more hers. She lay on the floor for a long time. The cold was serious. Without the fire, the back chamber was in the same temperature range as the mountain outside, and she was lying on stone in blankets that were no longer the primary heat source they had been when the fire was supplementing them. She needed fire. She needed it soon. She found the matches. She had kept them in the oilcloth pocket she had sewn into the inner layer of her coat for exactly the reason that they needed to be findable in the dark, by hands that knew where to find them. The first match failed. The striker surface was slightly damp from the snow that had come through the crack, and she adjusted the angle and struck the second match with the specific motion that produced flame on a damp striker, a harder and faster strike than normal. The second match failed. She took a breath. She thought about the specific physics of the damp striker surface, and she made the adjustment she should have made on the second match, and she struck the third. The third match failed. The fourth match failed. She lay in the dark with the box of matches in one hand and one match left, and the cold pressing into her from the stone below and the open crack above. And she thought about Earl, and she thought about Denton, and she thought about the porch of the cabin and the grave behind it, and the 35 years that had been built on this mountain. And she struck the fifth match with the absolute conviction of someone who had already decided what was going to happen. The flame caught. She held it to the pine needle tinder she had packed in the same pocket as the matches, and the needle tinder caught, and she fed the flame with the deliberate care of the most important thing she had done in the last 5 days, which it was. Twigs, then small splits, then the larger pieces added one at a time as the fire established itself. The chamber filled with the smell of burning pine and the light of a small fire and the slow radiation of heat from stone that had been holding cold for hours and would need time to give it back. She rebuilt the fire. She wrapped herself in the blankets over her coat. She looked at the empty woodpile. She had been in the cave for 6 weeks, and she had already faced the worst thing she knew how to face, the quiet voice of comfortable surrender, and she had answered it with the only answer that was available to her, which was another swing of the axe. January stripped her thin. She had known this was coming. She had understood since the inventory after the storm that the meat and the beans were quantities that had a terminal date in a winter that did not. And she had managed toward that date with the care she brought to all her management rationing, with the precision of someone counting days rather than hunger. The hunger was constant, not the sharp specific hunger of a missed meal, but the background hunger of sustained insufficient calories, the kind that lived in the body as a permanent conversation rather than an acute demand. The kind that changed the quality of everything, the way color changed in low light. The saturation reduced the edges softer. She moved more slowly than she had in November. She rested more often. She checked the traps, but the game was thin in January. The animals that had survived November and December had learned the patterns of the cliff section and were moving differently through it now, or were denned deeper, or had shifted their range in ways she could not fully track. Without more time and more energy than she currently had, she found pine nuts and boiled roots. She looked at her reflection in a pool of meltwater in the back chamber, and what she saw was a face that had been altered by what it had been through. Hollowed at the cheeks and at the temples, the eyes set deeper than they had been in November, with a quality in them that she did not attempt to name but recognized as the look of a person who had found out what they were made of. She was made of something that had not broken. She understood this not as pride, but as fact. The same way she understood the weight of a log or the temperature of the air, as information that was simply true and useful. She thought about the cabin. She thought about Earl's grave behind the cabin, the stone from the creek at the head of it that she had placed there herself. And she thought about the spring that was coming. The spring that was always coming regardless of what winter did between now and then. And she thought about what she intended to do when it came. She was going to walk down this mountain. She was going to walk into Blackwood Ridge. And she was going to take back what was hers. The wind changed on the 21st of March. She felt it before she could measure it. The way she had always felt the mountain's shifts, before they became legible through the stone she lay against, and the quality of the air through the chimney crack. And something older than either of these, the deep animal attunement of a person who had been living inside a mountain for 5 months and had learned to read it the way she read the faces of people she knew well, through small signals that accumulated into meaning before any single one of them was definitive. The temperature was the same. The sound outside was the same. But something in the pressure of the air had changed something in the quality of the light that came through the chimney crack in the morning. A different quality of whiteness, and she understood from that quality that the sky above Blackwood Ridge was doing something different than it had been doing for the past 4 months. She lay in the blankets and she let herself believe it. She had not allowed herself to believe in spring before this morning. Belief in an outcome that had not yet arrived was an expenditure she could not afford when the outcome was not certain, when the belief itself could do damage by creating expectation that the mountain was not yet ready to meet. She had operated on the principle of the present and the immediate future. The next fire, the next trap, check, the next piece of wood. And she had not looked further forward than the end of the week, because looking further invited hope, and hope in winter on this mountain was a luxury with a cost. But this morning she let herself believe. The thaw came the way thaws came at this elevation. Not as a reversal of winter, but as a negotiation between winter and what came after a slow and incremental withdrawal that maintained the right to return and exercised it repeatedly. There were 3 days in the 3rd week of March when the temperature above dropped to something that the stone inside the chamber registered as change. A slight warming that moved through the limestone and found her lying against it. Then a day that felt like November again, the temperature dropping and the wind returning from the northwest with the memory of violence. Then the negotiation resumed in the direction of spring. She waited. She had been waiting for 5 months. She could wait another week. What she was waiting for specifically was the crusting. She had been watching the snow that fell through the chimney crack with the attention of someone using it as a proxy for the conditions above. And what she was waiting for was the particular sound and quality of snow that had been through a freeze and thaw cycle and had consolidated into crust, the hard, granular surface that supported weight rather than collapsing under it. And that made travel on the slope possible without snowshoes, that were better than the ones she had. She had made snowshoes from pine branches and the rawhide strips she had cut from the last of her curing hide in February. And they were adequate in the sense that they were better than nothing, and she had tested their construction carefully. But adequate was not the same as good, and good was what the descent required. On the 23rd of March, she pressed her palm against the stone of the cave wall and felt something she had not felt since November. The stone was not warm. The stone in the back chamber had never been warm the way the fire-charged stones of a proper masonry structure could be warm. But it was less cold. The differential between the stone temperature and the air temperature inside the chamber was smaller than it had been, and the reason for that was that the rock of the mountain itself had absorbed enough of the changing surface temperature to register the change in its interior, and the change it was registering was in the direction she needed. She prepared. There was not much to prepare because she had so little remaining. But the preparation was important regardless of its scale, because preparation was the habit that had kept her alive through 5 months of conditions that should have killed a 63-year-old woman alone on a mountain. And she was not going to abandon it now that she was close enough to the end to see it. She sorted what she would carry and what she would leave. The rifle she would carry. The axe she would carry. Because it was Earl's, and because she had used it to save her life in the dark, and it had earned the carrying. The cast iron pot she would carry because it had belonged to her mother and had a gravity beyond its physical weight. The blankets she would wear. The remainder she left arranged along the back wall of the chamber, where it had been stored through the winter, the surviving tools and the remnants of supplies that had run out in January, the objects that had been part of the apparatus of her survival. She left them in order because disorder offended her, and because there was no reason to leave a mess, simply because she was leaving. She moved the stone from the passage entrance. She pressed through the tunnel toward the front chamber. The front chamber had the smell of 5 months of no human occupation, the mineral cold of unheated limestone, and something else, the faint smell of the outside world that had found its way in through the gaps she had sealed. And that was carrying with it the specific smell of March. At this elevation, the smell of snow releasing itself from its compressed winter density and beginning the slow process of becoming water again. She pushed through the main entrance crack. The light hit her with a force that was almost physical. She had not been unprepared for this. She had anticipated the adjustment that a person's eyes required after months in fire-lit darkness. But anticipating a thing and experiencing it were 2 different events. She stood with her eyes nearly closed while the world slowly became navigable. The white intensity resolving into the slope below her, and the sky above, and the line of trees on the lower ridge, and the distant suggestion of the valley floor far below where Blackwood Ridge lay in whatever state Blackwood Ridge was currently in. She stood there for a moment with her eyes adjusting, and her face in the March sun, which was a different sun than the November sun she had last stood in the angle of it higher, and the light carrying something warmer, not warm enough to be mistaken for summer, but warm enough to remind the skin that summer was a real thing that happened. She began to descend. The snowshoes worked as she had assessed them adequate against the crusted March surface, distributing her weight sufficiently to prevent the deep punching that made high-elevation travel in late winter so exhausting. The slope she had climbed in the dark 5 months ago with her hands bleeding and the pack digging into her shoulders was a different slope in March sunlight, the familiar made strange by the changing conditions and by what she had become in the time between. She was thinner than she had ever been in her adult life. She was weaker than she had been in November. But she was alive, and she was functional. And she was descending, and the descent was the thing that had been the goal since the morning she had rolled off her sleeping position and crawled across the floor of a dark cave toward an axe that she could not see. She took the eastern route down. She took it because the eastern slope was the more sheltered approach, and because the consolidation of the snow on the east face was more reliable than the south face, which had been subject to more direct sun exposure during the thaw cycles, and had a less predictable surface as a result. She took it for these practical reasons, and also because the eastern slope would take her past a section of the ridge that she had been thinking about since January. A section where Denton had been running a seasonal hunting camp for the past 3 years. A crude operation, 2 tents, and a wood cache, and the equipment a man brought when he intended to be on the mountain for extended periods during the hunting season. She had known about the camp. Earl had mentioned it the 3rd autumn after Denton came to Colorado, mentioned it with the particular neutral quality he used when he was conveying information about Denton that he thought she should have without editorializing about what it meant. She had filed it. She found it 2 days into the descent. Or rather, she found what the mountain had done to it. The avalanche track was visible from 200 yards out the wide swath of cleared slope, where the snow had released from the upper face and carried everything in its path to the lower angle of the ridge and stopped. The trees along the track margins were stripped of branches to a height of 20 feet. The ground surface within the track was scoured to the rock in places and buried under 15 feet of consolidated debris in others. The camp was in the middle of the track. She stood at the edge of what had been the tent site and looked at it for a long time. One tent had been completely erased the material, and everything in it ground into the debris by the weight and velocity of the slide. The second tent was partially visible, the canvas protruding from the compacted snow at an angle that told her the tent pole structure had partially survived and had created a small void in the debris field. She had not caused this. She understood this clearly, and she sat with the clarity of it for a moment. The understanding that the mountain had made a decision that was the mountain's alone to make. She had not been a cause. She had been a witness arriving after the fact to find what the mountain had found necessary. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific quality of stillness that arrived when a long-anticipated outcome came to pass, in a way that made triumph beside the point. The stillness of things having been decided by something larger than the question of who had been right. She began to dig. She dug with the axe handle, and with her hands, and with a piece of tent canvas, she extracted from the debris in the first minutes and folded into a makeshift shovel. The work was hard, and the debris was consolidated, but it was not ice, and it gave to sustained effort. She worked toward the void she had identified, toward the space where the standing tent pole structure had preserved a pocket of air. She found him 2 hours after she started. Denton Calloway was in the position of a man who had heard the avalanche coming and had pressed himself against the interior wall of the tent and had not had time to do anything further before the snow arrived. His face held the expression she had imagined when she had thought about this moment, which she had thought about in the long, dark hours of January when there was nothing to think about except the future and what it might contain. She had imagined anger in his face, or fear, or the collapsed quality of a man who had known what was coming. What she found was simpler than any of these, the face of a man in the last moment before consciousness ended, still holding the expression of whatever he had been thinking in the instant before the mountain made its decision. She did not speak to him. She searched him with the methodical attention of a person looking for something specific, and under his right arm, pressed against his side, in the way of something important that a man had grabbed when he heard the warning sounds, she found the metal box. It was a cash box. the kind that general stores used for their daily receipts, a flat tin rectangle with a simple clasp lock that had been forced open and reclosed so many times the mechanism was loose. She opened it. The cash was there, a quantity she did not stop to count. Precisely bills and coin, the accumulated liquid value of whatever Denton had been converting assets to over the past several months. Beneath the cash was a document. She lifted it carefully and unfolded it with fingers that were stiff from the digging and from the cold that had crept back into them during the hours of work. She read it in the March sunlight. It was the deed to the cabin and the claim on Blackwood Ridge. The original deed signed when she and Earl had filed their claim in 1847. Both their names on it in the official hand of the county recorder. The document that preceded any note and any transfer, and any of Denton's subsequent legal arrangements. The foundation document of everything. Under the deed was a ledger book, small and leather-covered, the kind a man kept in an inside coat pocket. She opened it. The entries were in Denton's handwriting, the same handwriting she had seen on the note pinned with her knife to the log in the front chamber of the cave. They were dated entries running from 3 years prior to the present season, and they were a record of payments. The name that appeared on the receiving end of those payments in regular amounts at regular intervals was Lucius Crane, Sheriff Lucius Crane, who had signed the transfer documents, who had stood behind the law that Denton had constructed around her, who had made it all official and unanswerable. She closed the ledger. She sat in the snow at the edge of what had been Denton Calloway's hunting camp and held the deed and the ledger in her cold hands and looked out at the valley below her, at the small, dense collection of buildings that was Blackwood Ridge from this height. And she understood what she was holding and what it meant and what she was going to do with it. She descended the remainder of the slope over the next 2 days. She stopped in the timber on the first night and built a small fire and slept close to it with the metal box inside her coat against her chest. She ate the last of what she had carried from the cave pine nuts and a strip of dried root, and she drank snowmelt, and she felt in the particular way of exhausted bodies that have not yet reached the end of what they are being asked to do sufficient. The second day she reached the valley floor. The mud of the early thaw was already working at the road that ran north from Blackwood Ridge. The freeze and thaw cycles of March churning the surface into the deep, viscous mud that made the approach roads impassable by wagon for weeks every spring. She walked in the wheel ruts where the ground was compressed and more stable, and she felt the change in terrain under the snowshoes as the elevation dropped and the snow cover thinned and then ended, and she was walking on bare ground for the first time since November. She stopped and looked at her feet on the earth. She took the snowshoes off and tied them to the pack. She walked into Blackwood Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon in late March of 1883, with the mud drying on her boots and the March sun at her back. She heard the silence before she was fully in the town. It moved ahead of her the way silence moved in a small community when something happened that nobody knew how to respond to, spreading from the first person who saw her to the next. The conversation stopping and the heads turning and the bodies going still. She heard it as an absence of sound that expanded as she walked, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday afternoon, the smith's hammer, a child calling across a yard, 2 women speaking outside the dry goods store, all of it stopping in sequence as she moved through the edge of town toward the main street. She let them look. She understood what they were seeing. She understood it not from vanity or self-consciousness, but from the practical understanding of what 5 months on a mountain in winter did to a person's appearance, the way it stripped away every non-essential thing and left whatever was underneath exposed. She was thin in a way that the word thin did not adequately describe. Her face had been worked by cold and wind and sustained privation into something that was not the face she had brought up the mountain in November. Her eyes had a quality she could not see herself, but that she understood from the way people received her gaze. Stepping back slightly, blinking, reassessing. She looked like the mountain. She walked to the center of the main street and she stopped. She was not performing this. She was not making a statement in the theatrical sense. She was simply standing in the place where she needed to stand for a moment before she did what she had come to do. And in that standing, she looked at the people who were looking at her. She looked at Galen Marsh, who ran the general store, and who had been standing in his doorway 4 months ago, when Denton walked her off her own porch, and who had watched the whole of it with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that neutrality in the face of injustice was a form of participation, and who had chosen it anyway because Lucius Crane was his sheriff, and Denton Calloway was a man who remembered things. She held his eyes for a moment. He looked away first. She looked at the Hensley women, mother and daughter, who had been the closest neighbors the Calloways had on the ridge and who had known Earl for 30 years, and who had brought food after every hard winter, and who had been inside their house with the curtains drawn on the morning Denton came. She had seen the curtain move. She had noted it and filed it. She held their eyes. The mother held back for 2 seconds and then found something to look at on the other side of the street. She looked at 7 people in this way, the 7 she had marked in November. And she did not say anything to any of them, and she did not alter her expression, and she did not make the moment longer than it needed to be. She was not here to punish them. She was here to be seen by them. She was here so that the choice they had made in November existed in 3 dimensions, rather than in the comfortable abstraction of a decision that had no consequences for the person who made it. They had decided she was gone, and they had arranged themselves around that decision. She was not gone. She was here looking at them from a face that the mountain had made, and whatever they did with that information was their own work to do. She turned. She walked to the telegraph office. It was a single-room building that served as the de facto center of official functions in Blackwood Ridge, the place where the sheriff kept his desk and where messages arrived and departed, and where the formal business of the community was transacted. Lucius Crane was almost always there on Tuesday afternoons, because Tuesday was when the weekly report to the county seat was composed and sent. She opened the door without knocking. Crane was at his desk with a pen in his hand. He was a large man, broad and heavy in the way of men who had been powerful in younger years and had maintained the frame of that power without maintaining its content, the physical presence without the underlying readiness. He looked up when the door opened with the automatic authority of a man accustomed to being the person in the room whose arrival and departure set the tone for everyone else. He saw her. His face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: disbelief and then recognition. And then a third thing that was more complex than either a recalculation. The look of a man whose understanding of a situation has just been fundamentally revised, and who is working very fast to determine what his revised understanding requires of him. She put the metal box on the counter between them. She said, "I did not die." She said it the way she said most things, without embellishment and without anger, in the flat, clear voice of a person stating a fact that requires no amplification, because the fact itself is sufficient. Crane looked at the box. He looked at her. He looked at the box again. He was a man who had made a particular calculation about her in November and had been living inside the comfort of that calculation for 5 months, had built his subsequent arrangements on the understanding that the woman who had walked off her own porch into a November mountain was a woman who was not coming back. The arrangement he had made, the agreement he had with Denton Calloway, the payments recorded in a ledger that was currently inside the metal box on the counter between them. All of it existed in the world that contained a dead Wren Calloway. She opened the box. She took out the ledger and set it on the counter beside the box. She opened it to the first page of entries, and she turned it to face him. She said, "I believe you recognize these." She watched his face as he read. She watched the recognition move through it, and the recognition of the recognition, and then the specific settling quality of a man who has understood that the thing he is looking at is the thing that ends a particular version of his life. He sat back. She picked up the ledger. She picked up the deed. She picked up the box. She said, "I am going to the county seat. I am going to the judge. I will tell you that if you are here when I return with the appropriate authority, I will present this ledger in any context that is required. If you are not here, I will present it anyway because the record is the record and it exists regardless of where you are." She looked at him for a moment. She turned and walked out of the telegraph office. She did not look back at the main street as she walked south toward the county seat road. She did not look back at the people who had watched her arrive and who were watching her pass again. She heard behind her the sound of the telegraph office door opening and closing, and then silence. And she filed the silence in the way she filed everything as information that would become relevant in due course. The county seat was 12 miles south. She walked it before nightfall because there was no reason not to, and every reason to complete what she had begun. Before another night intervened. The March evening was cold in the way of March evenings in Colorado, the temperature dropping fast after the sun moved west. But cold in the low country was a different thing than cold on the mountain, cold that had an end in the form of a building and a fire, rather than cold that was the entire atmosphere of existence. And she walked through it with the ease of someone who had been thoroughly educated in worse. The county courthouse was a 2-story frame building on the main square of the county seat, identifiable by the flag above it, and the air of official function that came from the quality of its construction, relative to the buildings around it. She went in. The clerk at the front desk looked at her with the wariness that her appearance produced in people who had not been told she was coming, the brief visual recalibration of someone whose categories were being reorganized. She asked for the judge. She waited 20 minutes in the hall outside his office, standing because sitting felt wrong after 5 months of choosing every position carefully for its utility. And then the clerk came back and told her the judge would see her. Judge Harlan Vey was 65 years old, a compact man with white hair and the specific quality of attention that came from decades of listening to people in rooms that required careful listening. He had the face of someone who had heard a great many things and had trained himself to receive them without allowing his assessment to become visible before it was complete. She sat across from him. She put the deed on his desk and the ledger beside it. She told him what had happened, not in the form of a complaint or a plea, but in the form of a report. The way she had always communicated important information with the sequence, correct and the relevant details present, and nothing included that did not serve the purpose of making the situation clear. She told him about the note and the transfer and the signature. She told him about November and about the cave and about the 5 months that had followed. She told him about the camp on the eastern slope and what she had found there. She opened the ledger and showed him the entries. He read carefully. He read the deed and the ledger and the contract clause that Denton had used the document she had obtained through the clerk of deeds on her way through the front office, asking for the copy that had been filed with the county when the transfer was processed. He read for a long time. When he looked up, his expression had the quality of a man who has completed a calculation and is ready to share the result. He said the transfer was processed on the basis of a note the validity of which I am prepared to question, given the evidence of the payments recorded in this ledger. The payments represent a material conflict of interest on the part of the officer who signed the transfer documentation. In my opinion, this transfer is voidable, and I am prepared to sign an order voiding it today," she said, and the sheriff. He said the records in this ledger represent evidence of conduct that requires investigation. "I will be sending a rider to Blackwood Ridge within the hour. She said I passed through Blackwood Ridge this afternoon on my way here. He said you walked from the mountain to this office today." She said yes. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not the wariness or the wariness-adjacent caution she had been receiving since she walked into town. It was something more direct than that, the expression of a man who has encountered something that he is going to carry with him for some time. He said, "I cannot imagine how you survived up there." She looked past him through the window behind his desk, at the line of mountains visible to the north and west, the long ridge of Blackwood Range with the particular profile she knew, the way she knew the profile of Earl's face in sleep, the specific heights and angles of it that had been the backdrop of 35 years of ordinary life and 5 months of extraordinary life. She said, "I did not survive it." She paused. She said, "I conquered it." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. She was back in Blackwood Ridge before sundown. The rider the judge had sent had arrived 40 minutes before her, which was the advantage of a horse over legs that had walked 12 miles south and 12 miles north in the same day on a diet of pine nuts and willpower. Lucius Crane had been found at his desk and had been disarmed, and was in the custody of the county deputy who had ridden with the rider. Vera Calloway had been found at the cabin which she had been occupying with the possession of someone who had arranged their furniture around the permanent absence of the person it belonged to, and had been taken into custody as well. Wren stood outside the cabin as the deputy and his men moved past her with Vera between them. Vera looked at her once. Wren received the look without changing her expression. She had nothing to say to Vera Calloway that the next months in a county courtroom would not say more effectively. The deputy handed her the cabin key and the signed order from the judge and tipped his hat and rode south. She stood outside the cabin. The door was there in front of her. The same door, the same hinges that Earl had set in the spring of 1848. The same wood that his hands had shaped and fitted and hung with the care he brought to everything he built to last. She knew the feeling of this door, the way she knew the feeling of everything in her life that she had touched 10,000 times. The specific resistance of the handle and the weight of the door on its hinges, and the sound of it opening, a sound that had been the sound of coming home for 35 years. She put her hand on the handle. She thought about Earl. She thought about him not with the raw, acute grief of November, which had been grief in the form of weather overwhelming and environmental inescapable. She thought about him with the grief of March, which was the grief of someone who had survived the winter that grief had thrown at her and who had come out the other side, not without grief, but with grief in its proper proportion to everything else she was carrying. She missed him with the specific and permanent miss of a person who has shared a life with someone and understands that the sharing is over, and that the over does not diminish the sharing, but only changes its relationship to time. She turned the handle. The cabin was different in the ways that things were different when the wrong people had been living in them. The small displacements and reconfigurations that spoke of different habits and different assumptions about where things belonged. Vera's arrangements were still visible in the room. The furniture moved slightly. The shelves reorganized. She walked through the main room. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at the window that faced north toward the ridge, toward the upper slope where Earl had died, and where she had made something from the materials of survival for 5 months. She looked at the mantelpiece. The wedding photograph was still there. She stood in front of it for a moment. The photograph was from 1847, the year they had arrived in Colorado, taken by a traveling photographer in the town they had passed through on the way west. And it showed two people who were beginning something. Rather than in the middle of it, the specific quality of anticipation, visible even through the formal stillness that photography of that era required. She picked it up. She held it. She set it back down in its place. She went to the window that faced south, away from the mountain, toward the county seat and the world below. The last of the March daylight was flattening against the horizon. The specific quality of early spring light at the end of a clear day, golden and thin and carrying the suggestion of longer days to come. She turned and went to the door she had come in through. She stepped out onto the porch, behind the cabin in the ground that had been frozen since November, and was now beginning the slow process of releasing its grip on what it had been holding. Earl's grave was visible under the pine that had been his landmark tree. The stone she had placed at the head of it had not moved. It was the stone from the creek limestone, the same material as the mountain she had spent 5 months inside. She stood on the porch. The mountain was behind her, the ridge of Blackwood Range, catching the last of the sunlight on its upper faces, while the valleys below moved into the shadow of the early evening. The pine trees on the upper slope where she had cut timber. In the first weeks, the rock face above where the cave entrance was the eastern ridge, where the avalanche had come down through Denton's camp. She stood on her own porch and she looked at it. Then she turned and went inside, and she closed the door behind her. And the March wind that came off the mountain in the evening stayed where it was, on the other side of the wood that Earl had shaped and fitted and hung 35 years ago. The door that had opened and closed for 35 years of ordinary life. She built a fire in the stove, not a mountain fire, not the small, careful fire of someone managing fuel against a long winter. A fire in a stove in a cabin with walls that were her walls, and a floor that was her floor, and a window that was her window. A fire of sufficient size to make the room comfortable by the time the evening cold arrived. Because she was home, and home permitted a different relationship to fire than the mountain had. She sat at the table while the stove ticked and the room warmed around her. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. They were the hands of a woman who had spent 5 months doing things that those hands had not previously been asked to do, the skin of them carrying the record of that, asking the scars and calluses and the altered texture of palms that had gripped an axe through a Colorado winter. They were her hands. They were the hands of someone who had survived, and of someone who had done more than survive. Of someone who had made a choice in a dark cave on a November night to answer a comfortable voice that was the voice of surrender, with the only answer available, which was another swing in the dark. She was 63 years old. She had come up the mountain with everything she had, and she had brought it back down, all of it, the tools and the knowledge and the specific irreducible self that was hers, regardless of what the mountain or the winter or Denton Calloway or Vera, or the people who had watched from their doorways had decided to do about it. She got up from the table. She went to the shelf where Earl's tools were hung. The tools that Vera had not disturbed because Vera had no use for them, and because they were the kind of objects that carried their history visibly enough that even a person with no particular respect for that history would leave them alone. She lifted down the small hand axe, the one Earl had kept for the fine work, the work that required precision rather than force. She held it. She put it back. She went to bed in the room that was her room, in the bed that was her bed, and she lay on her side of it, the way she had always lain on her side of it, because 35 years of habit did not dissolve in a single night. And she looked at the ceiling of the cabin that Earl had built, the boards he had fitted and planned and set, in the spring of 1848, when they were new to this mountain and were making the first of the things they would spend a life making together. The wood was dark with years. It was the darkening that happened to wood that had been inside a heated space through many winters. The slow patina of time and smoke, and the ordinary processes of a house that was lived in by people who were living their actual lives inside it. She looked at it until her eyes closed. Outside, the mountain held the cold of March at its higher elevations. The snow consolidated and hard and still several feet deep in the shadowed, north-facing reaches of the upper ridge. But the south faces were bare already, the dark soil visible and beginning to receive the warmth that the longer days were returning to it. And in the creek below the cabin, the water was running clear and cold over the limestone that had been silent under ice for 4 months. The water finding its way down through the channels it had been cutting for 10,000 years before anyone came to live beside it. She slept. The door held. The mountain was outside. She was inside. And for the first time since November, that was the only distinction that needed to be made.